backwards gripped the steering wheel of her 1989 Buick Century, her knuckles whitening as the engine let out a guttural groan and sputtered to a halt. The dashboard lights flickered, then dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the temperature gauge, its needle buried deep in the red zone. Steam billowed from under the hood, curling into the chilly evening air like a ghost escaping a tomb. She was stranded, alone, in the worst possible place in Riverdale, right in front of the Iron Horse, the notorious biker bar that every decent person in town avoided like the plague. The neon sign above the bar flickered, casting an eerie red glow across the cracked pavement, and the distant thump of hard rock music pulsed through the grimy windows. Martha's heart pounded as she realized the gravity of her situation. This wasn't just a breakdown, it was a nightmare unfolding in real time. Martha was 67, a widow who'd lived her entire life in Riverdale, a small town where everyone knew your name and your business. For 40 years, she taught second grade at Riverdale Elementary, shaping young minds with patience and kindness. Her classroom had been a sanctuary of construction paper crafts, multiplication tables, and the sweet chaos of children's laughter. She'd retired 3 years ago, after her husband, Frank, passed away from a sudden heart attack. Frank had been her rock, her partner in every sense, and their little blue house on Maple Street was filled with memories of a life well lived. They'd bought it as newlyweds, painted it themselves, and raised their daughter, Emily, within its walls. Emily was grown now, living in Seattle with her own family, leaving Martha to navigate her days alone. But she wasn't one to wallow. Riverdale was home, and she'd stayed despite friends urging her to move to Florida or some gated retirement community with golf carts and bingo nights. This town held her history, every street corner, every park bench, every diner booth where she and Frank had shared coffee and dreams. Thursday evenings were a ritual for Martha. After Frank's death, she'd thrown herself into volunteering at the Riverdale Community Center's food bank, sorting canned goods, packing boxes, and chatting with folks who needed a kind word as much as they needed groceries. It gave her purpose, a way to keep the loneliness at bay. She'd finish around 7:30 p.m., climb into her Buick, and drive the familiar route home, past the library, the hardware store, and the old oak tree where kids still carved their initials. She was careful, always sticking to well-lit streets, avoiding the rougher parts of town where trouble seemed to lurk. Riverdale wasn't a big place, but it had its shadows, and the Iron Horse was the darkest of them all. The bar sat on the edge of town, in a gritty pocket where the streetlights were perpetually burned out and the sidewalks crumbled into gravel. It was a squat, cinder-block building with a corrugated metal roof and a reputation that preceded it like a storm cloud. Over the years, Martha had heard the stories everyone had. Bar fights that spilled into the street, leaving bloodstains on the asphalt. Drug deals whispered in the back alley under cover of night. The constant roar of motorcycles tearing through town at all hours, shaking windows and rattling nerves. The local paper, the Riverdale Gazette, rarely mentioned the Iron Horse without words like notorious or trouble attached, and the police scanner buzzed with calls about disturbances there. Decent folks pretended the place didn't exist, crossing the street to avoid it, warning their kids to steer clear. Martha had never been near it, not once in her 67 years, and she'd planned to keep it that way. But tonight, fate had other plans. Main Street, her usual route, was closed for road work, the orange cones and flashing signs forcing her to detour. She'd sat in her car for a good 10 minutes at the intersection, her map spread across the passenger seat, plotting an alternate path. It'll be fine, she'd told herself, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. Just a few extra blocks. I'll be through this part of town in no time. She'd chosen a route that skirted the worst of the area, or so she thought, sticking to roads she vaguely recognized from years of driving Emily to soccer practice or Frank to his doctor's appointments. The Buick, though old, had been reliable, maintained with care by Frank and later by the mechanic at Pete's auto shop. She hadn't anticipated trouble, not tonight, Not on a quiet Thursday when all she wanted was to get home, heat up some leftover casserole, and watch her favorite cooking show. The first sign of trouble came about a mile into the detour. The temperature gauge started creeping upward, the needle inching past the halfway mark. Martha frowned, tapping the dashboard as if that might coax it back down. "Come on, old girl," she murmured, patting the steering wheel. The Buick had been with her through decades: road trips to the Grand Canyon, late-night drives to the hospital when Emily had appendicitis, countless errands and adventures. It was more than a car, it was a piece of her life. But as she turned onto a narrow street lined with abandoned storefronts and overflowing dumpsters, the gauge spiked into the red, and a horrible grinding noise erupted from under the hood. Steam poured out, obscuring her view, and the engine gave one final, shuddering cough before dying completely. She coasted to a stop, her heart sinking as she realized where she was, directly in front of the Iron Horse. Panic set in immediately. Martha's hands trembled as she turned the key in the ignition, praying for a miracle. The engine clicked uselessly, mocking her desperation. She tried again, then a third time, but the Buick was dead, as lifeless as the empty street around her. Darkness was falling fast, the last traces of daylight fading into a bruised purple sky. The bar's neon sign buzzed, its red glow painting the hood of her car in ominous hues. Through the bar's grimy windows, she could see shadowy figures moving inside, their outlines blurred by cigarette smoke and the flicker of neon. The music thumped louder now, a relentless beat that seemed to vibrate in her chest. Laughter, loud, raucous, and unsettling, cut through the night, and Martha's imagination ran wild. She'd heard the rumors about the Iron Horsemen, the motorcycle club that called the bar home. They were outlaws, people said, dangerous men who lived by their own rules, answering to no one. The kind of people who'd scare a widow like her without a second thought. Martha fumbled in her purse, her fingers brushing past tissues, a half-empty pack of mints, and her house keys before finding her cell phone. She pressed the power button, her heart sinking further when the screen stayed black. Dead. Of course it was. She'd meant to charge it at the community center, but she'd been distracted, helping an elderly man named Mr. Thompson carry his food boxes to his car. He'd been so grateful, his eyes crinkling with a smile, and she'd forgotten all about her phone. Now she was alone, with no way to call for help, no way to reach Emily or her friend Eleanor, or even the tow truck service she'd used once years ago. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was trapped, vulnerable, in a part of town where no one would come looking for her. She glanced around, hoping to spot a passing car, a pedestrian, anyone who might help. But the street was deserted, the only movement the occasional flicker of a moth against the bar's neon sign. This wasn't a through street, she realized with a sinking feeling. The only people coming down this road were heading to the Iron Horse, and they weren't the kind of people she wanted to meet. The row of motorcycles parked in front of the bar gleamed under the streetlight, their chrome reflecting the red glow like blood. Each bike was customized, adorned with skulls, flames, or cryptic symbols she couldn't decipher. They looked menacing, like sleeping beasts waiting to roar to life. Martha swallowed hard, her mouth dry, and whispered to herself, "I could wait for someone to drive by." But even as the words left her lips, she knew it was wishful thinking. No one was coming. Not here. Not now. Her eyes darted to the bar's windows again, where the shadowy figures seemed to multiply, their movements indistinct but purposeful. She imagined them watching her, sizing her up, a lone woman in a broken-down car, an easy target. The stories she'd heard over the years flooded back, tales of violence, of women harassed, of men who didn't take kindly to outsiders. She'd never believed the worst of the rumors, not entirely, but sitting here now, with the night closing in and her car as useless as a paperweight, those stories felt all too real. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she scolded herself for panicking. Get a grip, Martha, she muttered, clutching her purse tighter. You've faced worse than this. But had she? Losing Frank had been devastating, but it was a private grief shared with family and friends. This was different. This was danger, raw and immediate, staring her down through the grimy windows of a biker bar. A sudden burst of louder music jolted her, making her jump in her seat. The bar's heavy wooden door swung open, and a large man stepped outside, his silhouette massive against the neon glow. He had a shaggy beard and wore a leather vest covered with patches that glinted faintly in the dim light. Two other men followed, their boots crunching on the gravel as they moved toward the sidewalk. Martha's heart raced as one of them pointed at her car, then nudged his companions, saying something she couldn't hear. They started walking toward her, their strides purposeful, their shadows stretching long and menacing across the pavement. She checked her doors, ensuring they were locked, then scolded herself again. Locked doors wouldn't stop them if they wanted to get in. She was defenseless, exposed, a sitting duck in a town that suddenly felt foreign and hostile. The largest of the three men reached her car first, his tattooed arms visible beneath his vest as he leaned down to peer through her window. His beard was thick, his eyes shadowed under the brim of a worn baseball cap. He tapped on the glass, the sound sharp and startling, and gestured for her to roll down the window. Martha froze, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put, to keep the window up, to pretend she wasn't there. But he tapped again, more insistently, and called out, his voice muffled but not unkind. You all right in there, ma'am? The word ma'am caught her off guard, a touch of politeness she hadn't expected. Still, she hesitated, her fingers hovering over the window crank. Could she trust him? Trust any of them? She was alone, with no one to help her, no one to know if something went wrong. The other two men stood a few feet back, watching, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. Martha took a deep breath, steadying herself. She taught children for 40 years, faced down tantrums, parent complaints, and budget cuts. She'd survived Frank's death, the endless nights of grief, the slow rebuilding of a life without him. She wasn't helpless, not yet. Lowering the window just an inch, she met the man's gaze, forcing her voice to stay calm despite the tremor threatening to break through. My car broke down, she said, hating how small she sounded. My phone's dead. I was just figuring out what to do next. The man nodded, glancing at the steam still rising from her hood, his expression unreadable but not hostile. Mind if I take a look? He asked, stepping back slightly. I'm pretty good with engines. Martha stared at him, her mind a tug-of-war between fear and necessity. She didn't know this man, didn't know his intentions, didn't know if this was a trap or a genuine offer of help. But what choice did she have? She couldn't sit here all night, waiting for a miracle that might never come. The night was growing colder, the bar's music louder, and the shadows deeper. She needed help, and he was offering it, for better or worse. With a silent prayer, she nodded, her decision made. That would be very kind, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached for the hood release, her hand shaking, and braced herself for whatever came next. The iron horse loomed behind her, its reputation a weight on her shoulders, but she had no way back, only forward, into the unknown. Martha Edwards sat rigid in her Buick, her heart hammering as the bearded man outside her window waited for her response. The steam from her broken-down car still curled into the night air, and the neon glow of the iron horse's sign cast jagged shadows across his leather vest. His name was Ray, he'd said, and his offer to check her engine hung between them like a lifeline she wasn't sure she could trust. The other two men stood a few feet back, their faces half-lit by the flickering streetlight, watching her with a mix of curiosity and something she couldn't quite place. The bar's music thumped relentlessly, a pulse that seemed to mock her predicament. She'd lowered her window just an inch, enough to speak, but not enough to feel safe. "That would be very kind," she finally said, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound composed. She reached for the hood release, her fingers fumbling, and prayed she wasn't making a terrible mistake. Ray nodded, his expression unreadable but not threatening, and stepped toward the front of the car. "Pop the hood, ma'am," he called, his voice gravelly but calm. Martha hesitated, her hand hovering over the lever. Every story she'd heard about the Iron Horse flashed through her mind: bar fights, drug deals, the kind of trouble that kept decent folks like her far away. These men were part of the Iron Horsemen, the motorcycle club that Riverdale whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. Their vests, covered in patches and symbols, marked them as outsiders, rebels who lived by their own rules. Yet here was Ray, offering help when he could have just as easily ignored her, left her stranded in the dark. She pulled the hood release, the click loud in the quiet car, and watched as Ray lifted the hood, disappearing behind a cloud of steam. The other two men moved closer, and Martha's stomach twisted. The younger one, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that reminded her of her late husband Frank, leaned into view. "Ray's the best mechanic in the county, ma'am," he said, his tone earnest, almost reassuring. "Built half the bikes out front from scratch." His voice carried a warmth that caught her off guard, and for a moment, she saw Frank in his eyes, steady, kind, the kind of man who'd stop to help a stranger without a second thought. Something in his expression, a quiet sincerity, eased the knot in her chest. "I'm Bobby," he added, offering a small smile. The third man, older and stockier, with a bald head that gleamed under the streetlight, nodded but said nothing. His name, she'd later learn, was Tom. Martha glanced at Ray, who was already poking around under the hood, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who'd spent years wrenching engines. The steam had started to clear, and she could see him squinting at the tangle of hoses and belts, his fingers tracing components she couldn't name. "Blown radiator hose," he announced after a moment, his voice carrying over the low hum of the bar's music. "Happens a lot with these older models. Easy enough to patch temporarily, but you'll need a replacement soon." He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag he'd pulled from his back pocket, and turned to Martha, who'd cautiously stepped out of the car. "Can it be fixed?" she asked, her voice small as she hovered a few feet away, clutching her purse like a shield. "Sure can," Ray said, nodding. "Got the tools in my truck. Bobby, run inside and grab my toolbox from behind the bar, would ya? And see if Mike's got any radiator fluid." Bobby jogged toward the bar's door, his boots crunching on the gravel, while Tom lingered nearby, his arms crossed, but his posture relaxed. Ray turned back to Martha, his bearded face softening with a smile that looked almost out of place beneath his rugged exterior. "Should have you back on the road in 20 minutes or so, ma'am. I'm Ray Davis, by the way." He extended a grease-stained hand, and Martha hesitated before shaking it, her own hand feeling fragile in his calloused grip. "Martha Edwards," she replied, forcing a polite smile. "I appreciate your help, Mr. Davis." "Just Ray, please," he said, waving off the formality. "This here's Tom." He nodded toward the older man, who tipped his head in greeting, his eyes scanning the street as if keeping watch. Martha nodded back, her nerves still frayed but starting to settle. Up close, the men were even more intimidating, tall and broad-shouldered, their vests now clearly displaying the Iron Horseman MC patch that had fueled so many rumors in Riverdale. Yet their actions didn't match the stories. Ray was focused on her car, Bobby was fetching tools, and Tom was keeping a quiet vigil. It was disorienting, like stepping into a story where the villains turned out to be something else entirely. The bar's door swung open again, and Martha's breath caught as a crowd of people streamed out onto the sidewalk. Men and women, all wearing similar leather vests or jackets, moved toward them with purpose, their boots echoing in the night. Martha tensed, instinctively stepping back toward her car, her mind racing. Were they coming to gawk? To cause trouble? Ray noticed her reaction and chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Don't worry, Mrs. Edwards. News travels fast in the horse. Everyone's just coming to see if they can help." His words were meant to reassure, but the sight of a dozen leather-clad bikers approaching her broken-down Buick was anything but comforting. "Got the toolbox," Bobby called, weaving through the growing crowd, a heavy metal box in his hands. Behind him, a stocky man with a completely bald head carried a plastic jug of green radiator fluid. "Perfect timing," Mike Ray said, taking the fluid and setting it down near the car. He turned to the group, raising his voice slightly. "Everyone, this is Mrs. Edwards." Her radiator hose blew. To Martha's amazement, the bikers didn't just stand around. They organized themselves like a well-drilled team, each person taking on a task without needing to be told. Two men hauled portable work lights from inside the bar, setting them up to illuminate the engine. A woman about Martha's age, with a warm smile and a leather jacket, approached with a folding chair. "No sense standing around while they fix your car, honey," she said, setting the chair a safe distance from the now crowded engine compartment. "I'm Darlene, by the way, Ray's boss lady." She winked, and Martha realized she must be Ray's wife. "Water would be lovely, thank you," Martha said, still trying to process the scene unfolding before her. She settled into the chair, her purse in her lap, and watched as Darlene headed back inside. The bikers worked with surprising efficiency, their movements practiced and purposeful. Ray directed the effort with quiet authority, pointing out components and issuing instructions. Someone had brought out a small radio, and classic rock played softly in the background, mingling with the clink of tools and the occasional burst of laughter. It was surreal, like a scene from a movie she'd never have chosen to watch. These were the Iron Horsemen, the people Riverdale feared. Yet here they were, fixing her car, offering her a chair, acting like neighbors. A weathered-looking woman with silver hair tied in a long braid appeared beside Martha's chair, holding out a bottle of water. "First time at the horse?" she asked, her voice rough but friendly. Martha nodded, accepting the water gratefully. "Yes," she admitted, her fingers cold against the plastic bottle. "I wasn't expecting all this." She gestured at the crowd, the lights, the organized chaos. The woman laughed, settling onto an overturned milk crate next to Martha. "I bet. Name's Carol. Been riding with the Iron Horsemen for 20 years now. Most folks have us all wrong." "I'm starting to see that," Martha said, her voice softer now, her fear giving way to curiosity. Carol's eyes crinkled with a smile, and she leaned back, her hands resting on her knees. "Most of us are just regular people who love motorcycles and the freedom of the road. Ray over there works at the Harley dealership in the daytime. Bobby's a nurse at County General. I retired from teaching at Riverdale High last year." "You taught at Riverdale?" Martha straightened, her interest piqued. "I taught second grade at the elementary school for 40 years. "No kidding." Carol's face lit up. "You must be that Mrs. Edwards. My son had you back in '98. Jason Reynolds. Scrawny kid, always had his nose in a book." "Jason," Martha exclaimed, memory clicking into place. "Of course. He wrote that wonderful poem about his grandfather's farm. Won the county competition." The connection was like a spark, igniting a warmth she hadn't expected. She and Carol fell into easy conversation, swapping stories about teaching, about Riverdale, about the kids they'd watched grow up. Martha learned that many of the Iron Horsemen were veterans, tradespeople, or held regular jobs far from the dangerous outlaws she'd imagined. They were a community, bound by their love of motorcycles and a sense of loyalty that ran deep. It was a revelation, each word chipping away at the fear that had gripped her when her car broke down. As they talked, Martha's eyes kept drifting to Ray, who was elbow-deep in her engine, his hands steady and sure. Bobby handed him tools, while Mike poured radiator fluid with care. The other bikers moved around them, some joking, others focused, all part of a rhythm that spoke of long practice. Martha's fear hadn't vanished completely. She was still a stranger in their world, still aware of the patches and the tattoos and the weight of the Iron Horse's reputation, but it was fading, replaced by a cautious wonder. These people had no reason to help her, yet here they were, giving their time, their skills, their kindness, without asking for anything in return. Almost done, Mrs. Edwards, Ray called over, wiping his hands on his rack. Just letting the engine cool a bit before we finish up. Should be good as new in about 10 minutes. Martha nodded, her throat tight with gratitude. She turned back to Carol, her voice earnest. I really can't thank you all enough. I don't know what I would have done if... A sudden commotion near the bar's entrance cut her off. A young woman hurried toward Ray, a phone clutched in her hand, her face pale. Ray's expression changed instantly, his easy confidence replaced by worry as he took the phone and stepped away from the group. Even from a distance, Martha could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the phone. She glanced at Carol, her voice low. Everything okay? Carol's cheerful expression sobered. That's Lisa, Ray's daughter-in-law, probably calling about little Mike. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. Ray's grandson, 8 years old, fighting leukemia. Been in and out of treatment for the past year. Ray's son, Big Mike, works offshore on an oil rig to cover the medical bills, so Ray and Lisa share care duties. Martha's heart sank, a familiar ache blooming in her chest. She'd seen too many families go through illness, too many children who deserved better. That's terrible, she said softly. Is there anything they can do for him? There's a treatment they're trying to get him into, Carol said, her eyes fixed on Ray. Some new protocol that's showing real promise for his type of leukemia. Problem is, insurance won't cover it since it's still experimental. They're about $8,000 short, and the treatment slot opens next month. Martha watched as Ray handed the phone back to Lisa, his shoulders slumped. He said something, his voice too low to hear, then straightened, visibly pulling himself together before returning to the car. Everything okay? Bobby asked, his brow furrowed. Fine, Ray said, his tone firm but strained. Just a small fever. Lisa's got it under control. Now, let's finish up this radiator so Mrs. Edwards can get home. He dove back into the work, but Martha could see the weight he carried, the worry etched into his face. It was a look she recognized from her years of teaching, from parents who fought battles their children couldn't see. True to his word, Ray had the car running again 10 minutes later. The temporary patch on the hose was neat, professional, and he'd topped off her radiator fluid. This'll get you home safely, he said, closing the hood with a solid thunk. But you'll want to get a permanent replacement in the next few days. Old hoses like these tend to break down all at once. I don't know how to thank you, Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. The fear that had gripped her an hour ago felt distant now, replaced by a gratitude she couldn't fully express. Please, let me pay you for your time, the materials. Ray waved her off, his smile kind but firm. Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am. Glad we could help. Martha opened her purse, unwilling to let it go. At least let me contribute to your club fund or something. It's only right. Tell you what, Ray said, his eyes softening. Next time you're at that community center, help someone extra. That's payment enough for us. His words hit her hard, a reminder of the kindness she'd always tried to live by, now reflected back at her from the most unexpected place. As the bikers began to disperse, returning to the bar, Martha grabbed a pen and notepad from her purse, her hands moving on impulse. Let me give you my number, she said, scribbling it down. In case you ever need anything. It's the least I can do. Ray looked surprised, but took the paper with a nod of thanks. Martha climbed into her car, the engine purring smoothly now, and waved goodbye to Carol and Darlene, who'd come back outside to see her off. As she pulled away from the Iron Horse, the group of bikers stood watching, their figures silhouetted against the neon glow, making sure she got safely on her way. Driving home, Martha's mind raced, replaying the night's events. Everything she'd thought she knew about the Iron Horse had been turned upside down in a single evening. These weren't the monsters of Riverdale's rumors. They were people, flawed, maybe, but human, with lives and struggles and hearts that beat just like hers. And little Mike, she couldn't stop thinking about that brave boy, fighting a battle no child should face, and his family, desperate to save him. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Martha had made a decision. She wasn't going to let this end here. The Iron Horsemen had helped her when she needed it most, and now she was going to help them. Little Mike deserved a chance, and she was going to make sure he got it, no matter what it took. Martha Edwards sat in her idling Buick, the engine now purring smoothly thanks to Ray and the Iron Horseman, as she pulled away from the Iron Horse. The neon sign of the biker bar faded in her rearview mirror, but the events of the evening burned bright in her mind. Her hands still trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, but from a mix of gratitude and determination. The night had started with terror, her car breaking down in front of Riverdale's most notorious spot, surrounded by leather-clad bikers she'd been taught to fear. Yet, in less than an hour, those same bikers had transformed from menacing strangers into a community of helpers, fixing her car, offering her a chair, and sharing stories that shattered every preconception she'd held. Ray's steady hands, Bobby's kind eyes, Carol's familiar laughter, they were real people, not the outlaws of local legend. And then there was little Mike, Ray's 8-year-old grandson, battling leukemia, his family struggling to raise $8,000 for an experimental treatment that could save his life. That fact, more than anything, had lodged itself in Martha's heart like a splinter, demanding action. As she navigated the quiet streets toward her little blue house on Maple Street, Martha's mind churned. The detour that had led her to the Iron Horse felt like more than chance now, like a nudge from fate or maybe Frank's spirit, guiding her to a purpose she hadn't known she needed. She'd spent 40 years teaching second graders, pouring her heart into their futures, and after Frank's death, she'd found solace in volunteering at the community center. But this was different. This was personal. The Iron Horseman had helped her without hesitation, refusing payment, asking only that she pay it forward. And little Mike, his story wasn't just a tragedy, it was a call to action. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the decision was made. She wasn't going to let this night fade into a story she'd tell her friends over coffee. She was going to do something big, something that would make a difference for that boy and his family. The next morning, Martha was up before dawn, her usual routine of tea and toast replaced by a restless energy. She dressed carefully, slacks, a cardigan, her sensible loafers, knowing she'd need to look the part of the determined advocate she was about to become. Her destination was the First Presbyterian Church, where she'd been a member for decades, where she and Frank had married, where Emily had been baptized. The church was more than a place of worship. It was a cornerstone of Riverdale, a hub for community efforts, from food drives to school supply collections. And Pastor Jim, the congregation's leader for the past 15 years, was a man who listened, even if he didn't always agree. Martha knew she'd need his support to pull off what she had in mind, and she wasn't leaving his office without it. The church office smelled of old hymnals and coffee, a comforting mix that steadied Martha's nerves as she sat across from Pastor Jim. He was in his late 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a kind but cautious demeanor, the kind of man who weighed every decision carefully. Martha didn't waste time with small talk. "Jim, I had an experience last night that changed how I see things," she began, her voice firm. "My car broke down in front of the Iron Horse. I was terrified, but the people there, the Iron Horsemen, they helped me. Fixed my car, refused payment, treated me like a neighbor. And they're dealing with something terrible. Ray, one of their leaders, has a grandson, little Mike, 8 years old, fighting leukemia. They need $8,000 for a treatment insurance won't cover. I want the church to help." Pastor Jim leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his expression a mix of surprise and skepticism. "Martha, I don't doubt your experience, but the Iron Horse has a reputation for a reason. There have been incidents over the years, fights, arrests, you name it. Are you sure these are the kind of people we should be associating with? Martha bristled, her resolve hardening. Maybe so, Jim, but the people I met last night were kind, decent folks who helped a stranger in need. Isn't that what we preach about every Sunday? Looking beyond appearances to see the heart? They didn't judge me when I was stranded, and I'm not going to judge them now. That little boy deserves a chance, and we have the resources to make it happen. The pastor sighed, recognizing the fire in Martha's eyes. She wasn't just any congregant. She taught half the town's children, commanded respect from parents and colleagues alike, and had a stubborn streak that could move mountains. What exactly are you proposing? He asked, his tone softening. A fundraiser, Martha said promptly, for little Mike's treatment. We can organize it quickly. 2 weeks should be enough to spread the word and still meet their deadline. Silent auction, bake sale, donation drive, whatever it takes. The church can host it, or we can find a venue. But we're doing this, Jim. Those people helped me, and now it's our turn to help them. Jim rubbed his temples, clearly torn. The church had a history of supporting community causes, but aligning with the Iron Horsemen, even indirectly, was a risk. Riverdale was a small town and reputations mattered. Still, he couldn't dismiss Martha's passion or the moral weight of her argument. All right, he said finally. Let's put it to the congregation council. If they approve, we'll move forward. But you'll need to convince them, Martha. Not everyone's going to be as open-minded as you are about this. Martha nodded, undaunted. She'd faced skeptical parents, tight-fisted school boards, and countless challenges in her teaching career. Convincing a room of churchgoers was just another hurdle, and she was ready to clear it. By that afternoon, she'd rallied a small committee of church members willing to help, though not without resistance. Eleanor, her closest friend and a fellow volunteer at the community center, was the first to voice doubts. Martha, I know you mean well, but the Iron Horse? Those people are trouble. I don't want our church mixed up in whatever they're involved in. If you could have seen their faces, Eleanor, Martha countered, her voice steady but fierce. When they talked about that little boy, you'd understand. They're not monsters. They're just people, trying to save their child, no different than any of us would be. I was scared too, but they proved me wrong. Now it's our turn to prove this town wrong about them. Eleanor frowned, but didn't argue further, swayed by Martha's conviction. Others were less easily persuaded. At the council meeting 2 days later, Martha stood before a dozen church members, her notes clutched in her hands, and laid out her plan. She told them about the breakdown, about Ray and Bobby and Carol, about the way the Iron Horsemen had come together to help her. She didn't shy away from little Mike's story, describing his fight with leukemia in vivid detail, letting the weight of an 8-year-old's struggle sink in. This isn't about the Iron Horse's reputation, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. It's about a child who needs us, a family who's fighting for him, and a chance to show what this church, what this town can do when we set aside judgment and act with love. The room was quiet for a long moment, the air thick with tension. Some council members nodded, moved by her words, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Mrs. Carter, a retired librarian with a sharp tongue, spoke up. Martha, I respect what you're trying to do, but we have to think about the church's image. If we tie ourselves to those bikers, people will talk. It could hurt our other outreach programs. Then let them talk, Martha shot back, her eyes blazing. If we turn our backs on a child because we're afraid of gossip, what kind of Christians are we? I'm not asking you to endorse the Iron Horsemen. I'm asking you to help a little boy who's running out of time. If we can't do that, then this church isn't what I thought it was. Her words landed like a thunderclap, and the room fell silent again. Pastor Jim cleared his throat, stepping in to mediate. Martha's right that our mission is to help those in need, regardless of who they are. But we'll need to be careful about how we present this. Let's vote on it. All in favor of supporting the fundraiser, raise your hands. One by one, hands went up, some hesitantly, others firmly. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. The fundraiser was approved, and Martha felt a surge of triumph, tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. She had 2 weeks to pull this off, to rally a town that viewed the Iron Horseman with suspicion, to raise $8,000 for a boy most of them would never meet. But she wasn't alone. The committee, though small, was committed, and Pastor Jim promised to spread the word from the pulpit that Sunday. Over the next few days, Martha threw herself into the work with the same energy she'd once brought to her classroom. She spent mornings calling local businesses, asking for donations for the silent auction, gift baskets, dinner vouchers, handmade quilts. Most were hesitant when she mentioned the Iron Horseman, but her reputation as a beloved teacher carried weight, and she wasn't above a little guilt-tripping. "This is for a child," she'd say, her voice firm. "An 8-year-old boy who might not see 9 if we don't act. Can you help?" By the end of the week, she'd secured pledges from the diner, the hardware store, and even the florist, who offered a dozen centerpieces for the event. Afternoons were spent organizing volunteers, coordinating food, and designing flyers. Martha enlisted Emily, her daughter, to help with the graphic design, sending her ideas over email from Seattle. The flyers were simple but striking, featuring a photo of a smiling child, not little Mike, since she didn't have his picture, but close enough to tug at heartstrings. "Help Save a Child, fundraiser for little Mike," the headline read, with details about the event and a call for donations. Martha printed hundreds of them at the church office, her hands smudged with toner as she stuffed them into envelopes for mailing and tacked them up around town on bulletin boards at the library, the grocery store, the post office. Evenings were the hardest. Alone in her house, with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, Martha's doubts crept in. What if the fundraiser flopped? What if the town refused to show up, too prejudiced against the Iron Horseman to care about a sick child? And what if Ray and his family rejected her help? Carol had said they were proud, that Ray saw little Mike's illness as a private family matter. The thought of them turning her away, of her efforts being for nothing, kept her awake, staring at the ceiling as the clock ticked past midnight. The biggest hurdle, she realized, was that she hadn't told Ray yet. She'd been so caught up in planning, in convincing the church and rallying volunteers, that she'd avoided the one conversation that mattered most. What if he said no? What if his pride, or the Iron Horseman's code, made him refuse charity from outsiders? The thought nagged at her, growing heavier with each passing day. Finally, during a planning meeting with Pastor Jim, she admitted her worry. "I haven't told them yet," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. "I'm afraid they'll say no, that they'll see it as pity or something." "You need to let them know, Martha," Jim said, his voice gentle but firm. "This isn't just about the money. It's about building bridges in our community. If you're going to do this, do it openly. Show them you're not just helping, you're partnering." Martha knew he was right, but the idea of walking back into the Iron Horse filled her with a different kind of fear than the night her car broke down. Then, she'd been a victim of circumstance, a stranded widow with no choice but to accept help. Now, she'd be walking in as an equal, asking for something, offering something, stepping into a world she barely understood. Still, she couldn't back down. Little Mike's life was on the line, and she'd made a promise to herself to see this through. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Martha drove back to the Iron Horse, her stomach knotted with nerves. She parked in the same spot where her car had died, the memory of that night vivid and sharp. The bar looked different now, less intimidating in the early evening light, though the line of motorcycles out front was just as formidable, their chrome gleaming like a challenge. She took a deep breath, smoothing her cardigan, and pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping into the Iron Horse for the second time in her life. The interior was a surprise, not the dingy dive she'd imagined, but a well-maintained space with a long, polished bar along one wall, historic motorcycle photos on another, and a small stage in the corner for live music. The lighting was low but warm, the music, classic rock, of course, at a reasonable volume. Several heads turned as she entered, and Martha felt the weight of curious stares. She must have looked out of place, a silver-haired woman in sensible slacks, clutching her handbag like a lifeline. But then Carol spotted her from a table near the back, her face breaking into a grin. "Mrs. Edwards, what brings you back? Car trouble again?" "No, thank goodness," Martha said, managing a smile as she settled into the chair Carol offered. "I was hoping to find Ray. Is he here tonight?" "In the back office, doing the books," Carol replied, gesturing toward a door behind the bar. "Want me to get him for you?" "If you wouldn't mind," Martha said. "I need to speak with him about something important." As Carol headed to fetch Ray, Martha tried to ignore the glances from the other patrons. She felt exposed, a stranger in a world that wasn't hers, but she straightened her shoulders, reminding herself why she was here. Ray emerged a moment later, his bearded face registering surprise, but also a flicker of pleasure. "Mrs. Edwards, everything okay with your car?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag as he approached. "The car's fine, thanks to you," Martha assured him. "I was wondering if we could speak privately for a moment. It's about something important." Ray's brow furrowed, but he nodded, leading her to a quiet corner booth away from the bar's hum. "Is everything all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Everything's fine," Martha said quickly, then took a breath, steadying herself. "I came to talk to you about little Mike." Ray's expression closed off instantly, his jaw tightening. "What about him?" he asked, his tone guarded. "I heard he needs a special treatment that insurance won't cover," Martha said gently, choosing her words with care. "And that your family is having trouble raising the remaining funds." Ray's eyes narrowed, and she hurried on before he could interrupt. "It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is that our church wants to help. We're organizing a fundraiser for little Mike. Everything's arranged. Silent auction, bake sale, donation drive. It's happening a week from Saturday." For a long moment, Ray just stared at her, his face a mask of controlled emotion. When he spoke, his voice was low, measured. "I appreciate the thought, Mrs. Edwards, but we don't need charity. We take care of our own." "It's not charity," Martha said, her voice firm, echoing the conviction she'd felt in Pastor Jim's office. "It's community. You helped me when I needed it, no questions asked. Now it's my turn to help you. That's how communities work. We look out for each other." "You don't even know us," Ray protested, though Martha could hear the crack in his resolve, the weight of his worry for his grandson. "I know enough," she said simply. "I know you're a grandfather fighting for his grandson's life. I know you stopped to help a frightened old woman when you didn't have to. That tells me everything important about who you are." Ray looked away, his hands clenching on the table, his pride warring with his desperation. Martha pressed on, her voice softening. "It's a lot of money, I know, but there's a lot of it in this town. People just need a good reason to share it." After what felt like an eternity, Ray nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "For little Mike, I'll accept the help. But I want to contribute something in return. Maybe the club could provide security for your event, or help with setup and cleanup." Martha beamed, relief flooding through her. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said. Then, seized by a sudden inspiration, she plunged ahead. "In fact, what would you think about hosting the fundraiser here at the Iron Horse?" Ray's eyebrows shot up, and she rushed to explain. "It would be meaningful. 2 parts of our community coming together for a good cause. Plus, it would give people a chance to see this place as it really is, not as they imagine it to be." Ray stared at her, a mix of disbelief and admiration in his eyes. "You want to bring your church group to a biker bar?" he asked, almost laughing. "Why not?" Martha said, her smile unwavering. "If we're going to build bridges, let's start here." Ray shook his head, but there was a spark in his eyes now, a grudging respect. "You're something else, Mrs. Edwards," he said. "All right, let's do it." Martha left the Iron Horse that night with a lightness in her step, her heart full of hope. The fundraiser was no longer just a plan, It was a partnership, a chance to unite two worlds that Riverdale had kept apart for too long. She didn't know if it would work, if the town would show up, if they'd raise enough for little Mike. But she knew she was doing the right thing, and that was enough. As she drove home, the stars bright above Maple Street, she felt Frank's presence, a quiet pride in the woman she'd become. This was her fight now, and she was ready for it. The evening of the fundraiser arrived like a promise kept. The Iron Horse transformed from Riverdale's notorious biker bar into a vibrant hub of hope and unity. Martha Edwards stood just inside the heavy wooden door, her heart swelling as she took in the scene. The bar, once a symbol of division, gleamed under the soft glow of string lights strung across the ceiling, their warm light softening the edges of the cinder block walls. Tables lined the room, laden with donated items for the silent auction, hand-stitched quilts, gift baskets overflowing with local goods, vouchers for dinners at the town diner. The air smelled of fresh coffee, homemade brownies, and the faint tang of polished wood. The Iron Horsemen had outdone themselves, scrubbing every surface until it shone, arranging chairs in neat rows, and even setting up a small stage where a local acoustic band was tuning their guitars. Outside, the row of motorcycles glistened under the streetlights, no longer menacing but proud, like sentinels guarding a sacred cause. Martha smoothed her cardigan, her honorary Iron Horseman vest folded carefully in her purse for later. She'd insisted on wearing her usual attire for now, wanting to bridge the gap between her church friends and the bikers without drawing too much attention. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind, organizing volunteers, securing donations, convincing skeptics, and, most crucially, persuading Ray to host the event at the Iron Horse. That decision, born of a fleeting inspiration in the bar's quiet corner booth, had set the stage for something extraordinary. The fundraiser wasn't just about raising $8,000 for little Mike's leukemia treatment. It was about dismantling the walls that had divided Riverdale for generations, proving that kindness could rewrite even the deepest prejudices. As the first guests arrived, Martha greeted them with a smile, though her nerves fluttered. The church crowd trickled in tentatively, their eyes wide as they stepped into the Iron Horse for the first time. Eleanor, Martha's friend and one of the fundraiser's reluctant supporters, clutched her purse tightly, her gaze darting to the leather-clad bikers stationed near the entrance. Pastor Jim followed, his suit jacket a stark contrast to the denim and leather around him, but his expression was open, curious. Others from the congregation, Mrs. Carter, the librarian, young families with children in tow, even Mr. Thompson from the community center, hovered near the door, unsure of their place in this unfamiliar world. Martha could sense their discomfort, the weight of years of rumors about the Iron Horsemen pressing against their resolve to be here. But the bikers were ready. Ray stood near the bar, his bearded face breaking into a warm smile as he welcomed guests, shaking hands with a firmness that put people at ease. Darlene, his wife, bustled around with trays of cookies and water bottles, her laughter cutting through the tension like a breeze. Carol, the retired teacher who'd connected with Martha over their shared past, guided church members to the auction tables, explaining the items with a teacher's enthusiasm. Bobby, the nurse with Frank's kind eyes, chatted with parents, his easy demeanor disarming even the most skeptical. The Iron Horsemen had taken Ray's lead, embracing their role as hosts with a pride that was both fierce and humble. They weren't just helping a cause, they were rewriting their story, showing Riverdale who they really were. The initial awkwardness began to melt as the evening progressed. The acoustic band struck up a gentle rendition of a Johnny Cash classic, the music weaving a thread of familiarity through the room. Church members started bidding on auction items, their hesitancy giving way to excitement as they competed for a weekend at a nearby bed and breakfast or a custom motorcycle helmet donated by Ray's Harley dealership. Bikers and congregants mingled, their conversations tentative at first, but growing warmer with each shared smile. Martha watched it all, her heart full, knowing this was the bridge she dreamed of building, not just for little Mike, but for a town that had forgotten how to see the humanity in its own. A particularly touching moment came when Carol and Eleanor discovered a shared love of quilting. They stood near a table displaying a patchwork quilt donated by a local artisan, their heads bent together as they debated the merits of log cabin patterns versus starbursts. "I've got a stash of vintage fabrics I've been saving for something special," Eleanor admitted, her earlier wariness forgotten. "You should come by the church's quilting circle sometime," she added, almost shyly. Carol grinned, her silver braid catching the light. "Only if you promise to join me for a ride on my Harley one day." Eleanor laughed, a sound Martha hadn't heard in years, and the two women exchanged phone numbers, their unlikely friendship taking root. Pastor Jim, meanwhile, found himself in a corner booth with Tom, the quiet biker who'd stood watch the night Martha's car broke down. Over cups of coffee, they discovered they were both Vietnam veterans, their experiences in the war forging an instant bond. Tom spoke of his time as a mechanic in the Army, fixing Jeeps under fire, while Jim shared stories of his chaplaincy, offering comfort to soldiers far from home. Their conversation stretched on, punctuated by nods and silences that carried the weight of shared understanding. Martha caught snippets as she passed by, her eyes misting at the sight of two men, once strangers, finding common ground in a place neither had expected. The highlight of the evening was little Mike himself. The 8-year-old arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by his mother, Lisa, his thin face pale, but his eyes bright with curiosity. He wore a small leather jacket, a gift from the Iron Horseman, with a patch that read Little Iron. The crowd parted as he entered, a hush falling over the room, not out of pity, but out of respect for his courage. Mike moved through the guests, charming them with his questions about the motorcycles parked outside, about the band's guitars, about the model motorcycle up for auction. "That's a '67 Panhead," he told Mr. Thompson, his voice serious. "Grandpa Ray says it's a classic." Mr. Thompson, who'd never been near a motorcycle, nodded as if he understood, clearly smitten with the boy's spirit. Martha watched Mike from across the room, her throat tight. He looked so much like Ray, especially around the eyes, a spark of stubborn determination that refused to be dimmed by illness. Darlene joined her, following her gaze. "He's got his grandfather's spirit," Darlene said, her voice thick with emotion. "Stubborn as they come. Won't quit fighting no matter how tough it gets." Martha nodded, unable to speak. She'd seen that spirit in her students over the years, in children who faced challenges with a resilience that humbled her. Mike was one of them, and she was here for him, for all of them. As the evening drew to a close, Pastor Jim took the stage, his voice steady as he announced the fundraiser's results. "Thanks to your generosity," he said, "we've raised $12,000 tonight, $4,000 more than our goal for little Mike's treatment." The room erupted in applause, bikers and church members cheering together, their voices blending in a wave of triumph. Ray, standing near the back, looked stunned, his eyes glistening as he clapped, his pride tempered by gratitude. Martha caught his gaze and smiled, a silent acknowledgement of what they'd achieved together. The extra money, Ray later decided, would seed a fund for other families facing childhood cancer, ensuring the night's impact would ripple beyond Mike's treatment. Cleanup began as the last guests departed, the bikers and church volunteers working side by side, folding tables, stacking chairs, and sweeping the floor. Martha sat at the bar, exhausted but content, her hands wrapped around a cup of decaf Darlene had pressed on her. Ray approached, his boots heavy on the polished wood floor, and slid onto the stool beside her. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "What you did for little Mike, for all of us, it's more than I can put into words." "You already thanked me," Martha said, her smile soft but firm. "The night my car broke down, you showed me kindness when I was scared out of my mind. This is just me returning the favor." Ray shook his head, a wry chuckle escaping him. "When your car died right in front of our place, I thought you were gonna have a heart attack from fear. Never imagined we'd end up here." Martha laughed, the sound light and free. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Sometimes our breakdowns lead us exactly where we need to be. Her words hung in the air, a truth they both felt deeply. The Iron Horse, once a place of dread, had become a beacon of connection, a testament to what happened when people chose compassion over judgment. The friendship between Martha and the Iron Horseman didn't end with the fundraiser. It grew, rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose. The event became an annual tradition, each year supporting a different child in need, drawing larger crowds as Riverdale embraced the partnership. Martha became a regular at the Iron Horse, stopping by with trays of her famous oatmeal cookies, or just to chat with Carol, Darlene, or Ray. She never quite got used to the roar of motorcycles, but she learned to love the stories behind them, the sense of freedom and family they represented. The bar itself changed too. As word of the fundraiser spread, curious townsfolk began to visit, drawn by the welcoming atmosphere and the chance to see the Iron Horseman as more than their reputation. New customers became regulars, and the bar shed its notorious label, becoming a place where anyone could feel at home. A year after the fateful breakdown, the Iron Horseman surprised Martha with a gift, a leather vest of her own, custom-stitched with a patch that read, "Honorary Iron Horse Martha Teacher Edwards." She wore it proudly to every fundraiser, standing tall among her biker friends, her silver hair gleaming under the bar's lights. The vest was more than a token. It was a symbol of belonging, of a bond forged in crisis and strengthened by choice. Martha never rode a motorcycle, she left that to Carol, but she carried the spirit of the Iron Horseman in her heart, a reminder that courage and kindness could change everything. The most profound change, though, was in Riverdale itself. The artificial boundaries that had separated respectable citizens from those they'd shunned began to dissolve. People who'd never spoken before, churchgoers and bikers, teachers and mechanics, veterans and volunteers, found common ground in their shared humanity. The fundraiser had been a spark, igniting conversations, friendships, and a new understanding that Riverdale wasn't two towns but one, united by the simple act of caring. Martha saw it in the way Eleanor invited Carol to the quilting circle, in the way Pastor Jim and Tom met for coffee every month, in the way little Mike, now in treatment and gaining strength, waved to her from his wheelchair at the second fundraiser, his smile brighter than ever. It all started because Martha's car broke down in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, in front of a biker bar filled with people who knew that true strength wasn't about intimidation, but about lifting up a stranger in need. That night, Martha had been terrified, certain she was in danger. But danger hadn't found her. Instead, she'd found a purpose, a community, a reason to keep fighting for what mattered. The Iron Horse wasn't just a bar anymore. It was a symbol of what happened when fear gave way to trust, when a single act of kindness rippled outward, changing lives in ways no one could have predicted. So here's to the breakdowns, the moments that scare us senseless and force us to choose between fear and courage, between judgment and love. Martha Edwards chose love, and in doing so, she didn't just save little Mike. She saved a town, proving that the most powerful connections begin with a spark of faith on a dark road. Let her story remind us all, the next time life strands you somewhere unexpected, look around. You might just be exactly where you're meant to be, surrounded by heroes disguised as strangers, ready to change your world if you let them.